Buying a home can feel overwhelming, especially when you're not sure who to trust. Lane works as your advocate in the mortgage process, helping you understand your choices and avoid costly mistakes. From first time buyers to homeowners looking to refinance, his goal is simple: help you make the right move. Call or text Lane at 618-671-1830 to get started. Again, that's 618-671-1830. NMLS number 2413537. Edge Home Finance, NMLS number 891464. Equal housing lender. Now on to the episode.
Good afternoon or good morning. Feels like afternoon to me because I've been up doing stuff for a while. But good afternoon and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us on other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you would like to partner with us, you can do so at patreon.com/the particular Baptist. And I want to give shout out to one of our patrons here, the newest member of our patron family, Alan Jerkins. Thank you, brother, for your support and your interaction on the Patreon page. And I'm glad that our ministry is a blessing to you, and we appreciate your support. And also giving our monthly shout out to Petty France Church patrons, Stephen, Kyle, Sammy, Federal Theology. David, thank you so much for your support of the ministry. Again, if you want to join them, you can head on over to patreon.com/the particular Baptist to join them and partner with us. It's a great way to do that. All right. So diving into our topic today, more stuff on civil government. I know I've been kind of focusing on that a bit lately. I know we did Baird's, saying it right this time, brother, Baird's King of Kings. And that book was really good. It helped me to think about what promotion of religion means, and it doesn't necessarily mean active promotion. It can mean other things too, such as passive promotion in a way that a government can help promote Christianity in a way that isn't necessarily meddling in the affairs of a church, and therefore blending the jurisdictions where they shouldn't. And I think that's been helpful. And I think just as I'm learning these things more and coming to a realization of these things and seeing what's happening around us too. I mean, you see, you look at what's, for those of us in the U.S., I know we have somewhat of an international audience, but those of us in the U.S., in the state of Minnesota, in Minneapolis, we've had a lot of unrest over this past, months now, where you have the immigration enforcement and you have a lot of civil unrest there from the locals and clashing with ICE and trying to, and the fraud scandal with the daycare stuff. Just a lot of civil unrest going on and people calling the government to do something about it. And I think it can always raise questions about, like, what is, we want government to do something. I know we've talked a lot about what government is supposed to be doing in relation to its citizens. How is government to enforce laws? How, in a broad general principle sense, right? But we haven't really focused on what is a Christian's relationship to that. And I think early on in our podcast, I mean, we've been doing this. We're coming up on, I think, 5 years in May, if I remember correctly. It's 5 years that the Particular Baptist Podcast has been on the air. And one of the things we did early on was went through the confession. I think that was partly because, we're new and we didn't know what the heck we were doing and didn't know what to talk about. Particular Baptist, let's talk about the confession. But if I remember correctly, and we've done hundreds of episodes at this point, but I think we did a Romans 13 episode, or at least something related to it from our confession on maybe the chapter on the civil government. And we probably talked about the Christian's relation to civil government. I mean, that would have been about 5 years ago. And so a lot's changed, at least in my mind, on the matter. and understanding, maybe not fundamentally changed on the matter, but maybe the way it's expressed has been more clear, more precise, using better categories, and maybe staying away from some of the modern terminology that comes with discussing these matters. And so I think that there is, oh, hey, Federal Theology, just gave you a shout out at the beginning. Hope you're doing well, brother. Thanks for joining. But yeah, I think for me anyways, on the matter of civil government, there has, I think, been a development over time in kind of seeing how to better understand the role of government in relation to its citizens, but understanding how to better communicate the role of the Christian to government. Or even, you could even apply this, I guess, in a broader sense to all citizens of a nation. But I want to focus specifically on Christians because that's the audience we're talking about here, right? The podcast is not meant to be for everybody. It's directed at a Christian audience, or specifically a Reformed Baptist audience, and maybe secondarily a broader Reformed audience. But what we're talking about can certainly apply to everybody, right? But we see all these things going on in the world. We see all these the civil unrest. We see people going into a church in Minneapolis, related to the immigration enforcement stuff there. These protesters going into a church apparently that's affiliated with John Piper. But they're going in and they're protesting, and then there's discussion. They have Don Lemon and all that stuff going on as it relates to the journalism, and he was there, and he's being prosecuted or charged by the federal government on violating the FACE Act and things like that. And there's a discussion on protesting in churches and what that looks like. Is that really protected under the First Amendment, or is that not protected under the First Amendment? And then, of course, in that particular church, those Christians are kind of squashed in the middle, and it's like, what do we do? How do we respond to something like this? Do we go guns a-blazing at these people, or do we respond quietly? All those kind of questions are come up, and if you saw on Twitter after that event, people talking about plans for protecting their church and self-defense and all this stuff. And I'm not going to dive into those, how should we handle. My point is, these types of events bring up questions on how are we to respond to things like this in relation to the civil government, in relation to being attacked in this way, but specifically to the civil government. How is a Christian to respond to this where they are, right? These types of things. Civil unrest comes, we look to the government, we go, hey, you guys are supposed to be helping us. What do we do here? So, these general principles I want to bring out that are found in the particular Baptist tradition. Now, I'm not going to go to the place, for that you might think I go to, right? I'm not going to go to, I'm not going to jump to our confession. I think people can kind of go and look at that themselves. Obviously, what I'll be talking about here is, in principle, at least, in our confession. But I do think that I wanted to look at some other sources from our tradition, and I want to kind of put that kind of front and center here. So, if we're looking at kind of the general principle of a Christian's relation, so government, again, these things can apply to everybody in general. This is not just a Christian problem, right? How Christians respond to government is really how everyone in a nation should respond to government. Okay? It's a human problem. And it is really engrafted in the Noahic covenant in terms of the establishment of government, right? At least, reestablishing it. Obviously, there were governments before that, but as we know from Romans 13, government's job is to keep sinful men in line, right? So Genesis 9 kind of reestablishes that. now that you have the very few left in the human race after the flood, now you have God kind of reestablishing these ground rules on how society is to be run, right? And in Genesis 9, we see the clear law being laid out by God that if someone sheds blood, his blood shall also be shed, right? The point that you murder someone, you're going to capital punishment is the only just response in this scenario. So you see these civil matters being dealt with, right? God is establishing his government is to kill those who murder other people. And so there is this relationship that's established there with government and people, but it's not just with Christians, right? Yes, Noah's family was considered godly, but they were the only humans around. So we can say that this was established with all mankind. So this is something that is binding for all men everywhere. These are things that really are tying back to nature, right? In terms of the enforcement of these laws post fall world, right? Now, this is obvious. If you listen to our episode on responding to Brother Wolf's book on Christian nationalism, this was one of the issues we had was that he claims in his book that that government is natural, right? Pre-fall, that there would have been government needed pre-fall. Well, we would argue the scriptures clearly reveal that it's something that is post-fall and something that is there to keep society from destroying itself, rather than something that's needed pre-fall. Just taking the clear text of scripture and using that to interpret the unclear, the speculative pre-fall side, which is we know little to nothing about aside from what the text tells us. So, there's some differences there, but that's really what government is for. So, from a Christian's perspective, we do have a particular care in obeying civil governments because we as Christians claim to obey God. We say we follow Christ. We claim the name of Christ. We've been baptized with him. And so there are, I guess, greater obligations in a sense because we have more light. We have the light of faith, not just the light of nature. And so we are held to a greater account because we have greater light. And so there is almost like this kind of like archetype behavior, if you will, that Christians are to be an example to those around them, right? So we should be really model citizens in a society, right? We shouldn't be the rabble rousers and the ones who are causing trouble where trouble isn't needed, right? We should be obeying laws in accordance to just laws, I should say, laws that are just and good. And obviously, there's not going to be a perfect law anywhere. We obey the good in any laws where applicable, right? But we should be model citizens as Christians because of who we are as those who claim the name of Christ. We're expected as Christians to obey nature and special revelation. We're not held to account for the light of faith. Um, or I'm sorry, the unbelievers are not held account to the light of faith because they only have the light of nature. But we have both. And so there's a greater obligation there from our side because of that. Now, another thing, so civil government is not just a Christian problem. It's everybody's problem. Everyone finds themselves in a nation somewhere in some sort of governmental system that they have to abide themselves in, unless you're on some like unclaimed territory somewhere where there is absolutely no government established. But even then, there will be some order that will be in place. Maybe not in a formal civil government sense, but generally speaking, you're going to find people everywhere in some sort of civil setting because of most of the earth is run by different nations. But, looking at obeying civil government in principle, obeying civil government promotes the civil good and is a way of loving our neighbor. And of course, in the United States, I think we like to, we're all about our freedoms, we're all about our rights. And that's fine because that's fine in a way, because that's how our governmental system is set up. And that's another thing too. It's going to depend on where you are, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but it depends on where you are in terms of the governmental system. It's not going to look the same everywhere you go. But in the United States, there is a little bit more liberty given to, quite a bit of liberty given to the people. And so people don't always have to obey uh, the government if they're telling you to do something that is against the law of the land. In fact, you might be able to argue that it would be wrong to obey them because of the superior law to the land, which in our case would be the Constitution. That's certainly up for debate, but there's, you might be able to make that argument. But we're a republic. There's a lot of liberty given to individual states, right? And so the relationship of a Christian to those states and a Christian to the federal government might not be the same as, a full monarchy somewhere. But the point is that obeying civil government in whatever governmental system you find yourself in as a Christian, it promotes a civil good, and ergo, it's a form of loving your neighbor. So if you're following just laws of the land and obeying God in that way, and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you are promoting civil peace, which helps everyone around you. If you're peaceable, then other people around you are likely to be peaceable, right? And you're promoting a quiet and peaceful life for everybody, which is what we're called to do as Christians. When Paul tells us to pray for those in authority over us, he says that the reason why he says to do that is so that we as Christians can live a quiet and peaceful life. And if we're living a quiet and peaceful life because the government is off our backs and doing what they're supposed to be doing, it has an effect on everyone around you. So it's a form of loving your neighbor to obey government, to pray for government, to respect government, right? In principle, because it helps your neighbor. It's a form of loving your neighbor. We want to live a quiet and peaceful life. That's one of the reasons I moved way out here, almost 2 hours from Washington, D.C., out in the boonies almost, because I wanted to have a quiet and peaceful life. I didn't want all the craziness around me. It's a lot easier to live a quiet and peaceful life when you are squashed in the middle of a city, right? Or living in the suburbs of a city. It's a lot harder to do that. Maybe you go to a place where you can live a quiet and peaceful life and people are generally quiet and leave you alone. It makes it a lot easier to do that, right? Because the government is positioned out there and conditioned in that way, if you will, for people to live a quiet and peaceful life. So there's not a lot of commotion, right? You want a government that gives you that. You want a government that allows you to do that and promotes that for everybody. And as Christians, we should be praying for government to do that. That is actually pleasing to God, and the scriptures are clear about that. We want to live a quiet, peaceful life. That's a good thing to desire. It's a good thing to desire. We weren't really designed to live the rat race. Yes, some of it, I have to commute to Washington, D.C. from where I live. And, there is a sense where the rat race is real. That's where the money is. That's what you got to do. But in terms of, what is ultimately God's will, in the ideal sense, I guess, is that we would live a quiet, peaceful life. So the scriptures are very clear about. So it's a good way of helping your neighbor. And I'm going to look at, through our discussion today, from some declarations that different particular Baptists made. There's a 1647, 1659, and 1660, all of which dealt with civil government and, providing different principles along those lines. And this is from the 1647, a declaration of some of those people in or near London called Anabaptists. So remember, particular Baptists were accused of just being the Munsterites, like from Germany, who caused a bunch of civil unrest there. And they're saying, no, we're not those people. They say, quote, "We do declare that as for magistrates, we own them to be God's ministers, and that they bear not the sword in vain, but have their power given them by the Lord, to the end they might be a terror to them that do evil, and a praise to them that do well." So there's this clear declaration from particular Baptists that the government isn't just necessary, but they're also God's ministers. They are servants of God in a sense to punish evil and to promote the good, right? So particular Baptists were not public sedition. There were particular Baptist, like I think it was the Fifth Monarchists. It may have been the Fifth Monarchists. There may have been others, but there were particular Baptists who caused some problems. But all in all, the general principles that you found among particular Baptists, at least in the consensus view, was that government is to punish those who do evil and to promote the good, right? And that Christians should submit to government where appropriate. So government was to keep order, again, so that we may live in peace. And this idea of peace among particular Baptists was living a quiet and peaceful life, obeying government. Say, we declare that it's our duty, enjoined by us by the Lord, to submit to them in all things and to obey every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, viz., when they shall command things civil and lawful, then in those things actively to obey them. That's from the same declaration. And then in the 1659, they say that it hath been our profession that and is our real practice to be obedient to magistracy in all things civil and willing to live peaceably under whatever government is and shall be established in this nation. For we do believe and declare magistracy to be an ordinance of God and ought to be obeyed in all lawful things. Declaration, and this is from a declaration of several of the people called Anabaptists in and about the city of London, 1659. So in 1659, they had to kind of defend themselves again against the accusation that they were seditious people. And at least in the 1659, they were being accused of saying they wanted to murder their opponents and cause all kinds of civil unrest. And they're like, no, we're not betraying the king. We're trying to stay true to the king in all lawful things and obey God, right? We believe in government. It's necessary. It's ordained by God, and that Christians should submit to it. And they don't just say this is our profession. They say this is our real practice. We're doing this now, right? We don't just speak out of one side of our mouth and then live like hypocrites. We're actually doing this, right? They didn't want to give any reason for the government to come after them. So, but notice that here, in all things civil and willing to live peaceably under whatever government is, right? So the particular Baptists were not advocating for any particular form of government. They weren't saying, well, we need a monarchy or it's not a godly government. So whatever the government is, if it's a republic, if it's a monarchy, right? Whatever it is, it's ordained by God and we're going to submit to it. And we as Christians have an obligation to do that. Because again, particular Baptists were accused of being a rebellious people along with those actual Anabaptists, and Munster in Germany was always the example gone to because of those Anabaptists there who had caused so much civil unrest and rebellion. They took over the town of Munster. They caused all kinds of problems. The authorities had to go in and basically wipe them out. It was a mess. And so particular Baptists were associated with that event, even though they had nothing to do with it, and rejected it. They said no. And I think they even basically said, like, the only thing of commonality between us and these people is the fact that we just believe in believers' baptism, but that's it. We reject this silliness about government, and we're not those people. And PBs were like, no, we're not going to live like this. This is absolute silliness that we would ever live in this way. And so what you find is, this pushing for and advocating for a government that, and I'm having trouble with my camera here. I don't know how long it's been off. Hold on. I apologize. Always something technical that goes on here that oh boy. Okay, we'll be going to the webcam for now. I apologize for that. So the quality just went down by like 200%, but here we are. It's better than nothing. Anyways, particular Baptists, they were seen as seditious people, and so it was something that they had to really address and come to grips with, that they were going to be labeled as seditious people, and they had to respond to it, and they weren't going to sit by and let their good name be dragged through the mud. They're like, no, 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 we are godly people. We're not going to put up with this. We're not going to put up with this at all. One thing that's interesting that they bring up, this is from the 1660. They call it the humble apology of some, commonly called Anabaptists. It's kind of like a declaration. I mean, you got to understand, an apology was not an apology of I'm sorry for something. This was a defense, right? An apology, a defense of something. And so you see this mindset of, again, we got to clear our name. We got to clear our name. We got to come back and man, my camera is all messed up. I apologize, guys. I don't know what happened. It just this is gonna completely torpedo the video here. I don't know what in the world is going on with my camera right now. Yes, trust this computer. There we go. All right. I apologize, guys. Fixing this on the fly here. That's what happens when you're a one-man shop. I don't have producers. I don't have camera people or anything like that. I got to figure, if something breaks, I got to figure it out on my own. So, yeah. So I apologize for that. But anyways, back to what we're talking about here. One thing that you find among particular Baptists is their desire not only to openly obey the civil authorities, but to also not give reason for the civil authorities to come after them. I found that very interesting when I was putting, kind of studying for this, and I found it really, really interesting that the particular Baptists went out of their way to really speak to the king and say, look, we're not trying to cause trouble for you, Your Majesty. We're trying to live peaceably. We're trying to live quietly. If there's any doubt in your mind that there's any disloyalty, we want to settle that right now. And I think that was something that they did very effectively. In the 1660, they said, we may not, therefore, be so negligent of our duty unto God and respect of our profession or unto ourselves and families as silently to suffer our names and profession to be buried under such causeless infamy. Neither may we be so much wanting of our duty to our king as by such sullen silence to offer his majesty such occasion of being jealous and suspicious of our loyalty and obedience. And they go on to, and they keep going on. But the point is, they see it as a duty to God in respect to our profession or unto ourselves and families. For their own family's sake, they did not want to give government any reason to come after them unnecessarily. Obviously, they weren't going to deny their faith in order to appease the government if it didn't like them. But in all things lawful, they wanted to, like, look, we're not trying to give any trouble here. We're not those people. We don't want to give any occasion that you, Your Majesty, would doubt our loyalty to you because we're silent on the matter, right? And these guys were trying to cover every base. I mean, yes, their lives were at stake. I mean, I think that's where it says, for unto ourselves and families, it's like we have a duty to protect ourselves and our families too, because, we don't want to put them in unnecessary risk or in great risk at least. But it's interesting that they went out of their way to talk about that. And I think that it's something that we have to, even as Christians, I think we have to be careful of, is not give occasion. I think again, in the United States, I think we tend to be we like to be flamboyant in language. We like to make a scene and protest if we don't like something. And we do have a right to protest, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that in principle. That's good in a way. But I think the mindset of liberty and freedom in this, I think it can lead to an over suspicion of government. And I think it can lead people to do things that give a government a reason to watch Christians in a way they probably wouldn't have otherwise. And there's multiple examples of how you could do that. But I think it's something that that does happen and certainly can happen because of the nature of independence and liberty, right? This hyper individualism where government is seen as a hindrance all the time in every way, or government is generally seen as a hindrance and not seen necessarily as a good thing from God that's there to keep everything in line. And so I think it can make people suspicious, or it can make people do things that could cause government to come after you as a Christian and watch you unnecessarily. And the particular Baptists were like, no, we're not going to do that. At least the ones who signed this, the 1660, are like, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to give any reason for you to come after us. We just want to live peaceably, quietly, and worship according to our conscience, Your Majesty. We don't want to be any trouble for you. We want to help you keep society peaceful by living peaceful, by promoting good laws, by advocating that you promote the good, right? Those kind of things. We're here for you. We're here to help you. We're not here to be your enemy. We don't want you to come after us. So that's a very interesting tidbit that you don't find in our confession of faith explicitly. Doesn't mean it wasn't there in the background, or it's a principle that we can't see as being a necessary consequence of what's in the confession. But that's something that stuck out to me. Another thing that's interesting from particular Baptists, they talk about meddling in state affairs. They say this is also from the 1660 Apology. They say, we believe and declare that it's not our business to meddle with their state affairs or the government of the Commonwealth, unless by them duty call thereunto further than according to the will of God, to pray that we may live a peaceable life under them in all godliness and honesty. So I think the principle here, at least from an elder's perspective, because these are pastors that are signing this, at least from an elder's perspective, they should not be spending much, if any, time lobbying government for particular positions, particular laws, or even spending much time in politics from the pulpit, except where necessary for their congregations. That is not something that is very popular today. Again, in the U.S., there's a lot of problems that come from having living in a place where freedom of speech and independence is so strong and hyper individualism reigns. It can create a lot of problems. If individualism and liberty and independence are not put in their proper place, I think it can lead to a lot of problems. But pastors shouldn't be lobbyists. That's not their job. That's not their God-given role. And in terms of the scriptures, their role is to focus on their local church and the problems. I mean, they got enough problems to deal with in their local church. What are they doing up on Capitol Hill lobbying for a particular law? That's outside of the realm and jurisdiction of a pastor, generally speaking. Now, I say that because here in the Declaration, they do carve out a reason for it. They say they meddle their state affairs of the government of the Commonwealth unless by them duly called thereunto. So if duty requires it, we will do it, but they have to be called to do it. And I think the way I read this, it's being called I think it's probably being called by the government to speak on these matters, not out of your own free will, but maybe it does. Maybe you might have to do so out of duty. I don't know. It might fall under that, but they have to meddle in state affairs basically only as necessary, and then according to the will of God to pray that we may live a peaceable life under them in all godliness and honesty. Again, that's quoting from I believe it's Second Timothy, First or Second Timothy. So again, that pastors are to be involved in government in a very limited sense. So we have to be careful. It's easy for I think there are some pastors who like to, they're always talking about political issues, and it's other theological topics are minimized, or they're lobbying, and it's just like, that's not your job. There's other people who are better suited to take up, although lobbying, I have my own issues with lobbying. I work in the District of Columbia and have been around the lobbying community quite a bit. It's definitely not a place that I think Christians should just be diving headlong into. But I think there's probably places you can lobby in a Christian way, but it's basically bribery otherwise, in my opinion. But anyways, regardless, it's not the job of a pastor. Pastors are to focus on their flocks. That might upset some people. We have to be careful, right? Pastors are to shepherd their flocks, and sometimes that might mean talking about politics from the pulpit. Maybe they have to. Maybe there's particular societal issues that are affecting the church directly, and they need to address it. Maybe there's things that are swirling around in the community. Maybe the members are coming, "Hey, pastor, what do you think about this?" And it's like, okay, I got to address this. Things like that, out of necessity, right? But it's not something that should be a normal. You shouldn't be known for that, right? Pastors shouldn't be known for that. For some reason, today, I think we think it's a pastor's job to spend a significant amount of time in general pushing a political position from the pulpit, and or to spend their time lobbying for certain laws to be passed. And again, that's contrary to the mission of an elder as found in Scripture. Paul commissioned Timothy to teach sound doctrine, love his church, keep order in the church, disciple the flock. That's your job. Well, and he even tells Timothy to do these things to the point of exhaustion. Well, if you're doing that at the point of exhaustion, you don't have much time for anything else, right? Not really. Not really. Again, that doesn't mean a pastor can't do anything else. It just means that his focus is his attention is focused on his church. He's not going to have time to go to Capitol Hill. He's not going to have time to spend all this amount of time talking about politics from the pulpit, right? Because he's discipling his church in the way that he should be. Okay. So we have to be really careful about that. And then, of course, obeying civil government for the Christian gives a good testimony for Christ, right? I mean, you look at how these particular Baptists handled themselves. You can imagine that there were particular Baptists, or the government was looking at these guys. I mean, the particular Baptists obviously had problems, even though they defended themselves. But you can imagine that there were those in government who probably were like, "Hey, yeah, these guys they're not crazy. Look, they confess the same fundamentals of the faith that we do. They're clearly not trying to cause any civil unrest. They probably earned respect from that, from the government over that, because it brought a good testimony for Christ. To bring it back to God. We're glorifying God. We're doing this because we believe it's our God-given duty as Christians to do this. This is not something that we're trying to reject here. We're as Christians. We're trying to be good Christians and good citizens, right? And of course, as mentioned earlier, how you obey a government is going to look different depending on where you are, right? So the points that we've provided are principles that will look different depending on where you are. And again, like in the US, we're a republic, and many rights are afforded to citizens, and that some other countries may not be. It might be rebellious for someone to speak their mind, and or publish an opinion that's contrary to the government in a newspaper or something, and they might go to prison for it or die, depending on where you are. But in that country, if it's not unlawful, if it's not violating God's law, then that would be how you obey. How you obey God. You submit to the government, right? Recently, there was a podcast that Brother Wolf did. He talked about the promotion of religion, and he spent quite a bit of time talking about the difference between genus and species. Those categories. Genus is kind of like the generic category, and then the species are those specific things that fall under the genus, right? In this case, he was talking about it. Excuse me. Genus of how government carries out these things, but or the genus are those things that are supposed to be done all the time by government, right? And then the species are the how the government is to do those, that carry out those immutable principles, right? Which may look different depending on the situation, on the context, whatever the case is, right? So I think the same can be said for Christians submitting to governing authorities. And the genus would be those general principles, like Christians are to always submit to government, right? That's a principle that's there. It's ingrained in Scripture. We're always submit to government, except for when they tell us to do things that are clearly against God's law or against God's law. We're not to do it, period. But then the species aspect of it, those specific things of the how we're to carry out obedience to government, is going to look different depending where you are, right? And I think this is important because, again, I keep picking on the U.S. I'm an American, but I think this is where a lot of these things, like Americans, we love to think that democracy is somehow the ideal government and that we got to carry that everywhere around the world. I mean, we spent a whole 25, 30 years in the desert trying to establish democracy in a place that doesn't want it, right? Proving the point that how a government is implementing something is not always the best way of implementing something, right? Because the context, the people there are different, the culture, the customs are different, the way people want things are different, right? And so it's not going to work, or they just don't want it. It might not be the best place to do it. But the how a Christian submits to a government is going to look different. It might be under a tyrant, right? If a tyrant comes up with lawful things that they're to obey, then Christians are to obey that in that context. That's what we're to do, because the genus is that immutable principle that Christians are to submit to government and all things lawful, right? It doesn't matter what governmental system is in place, right? If it's not a democracy, that doesn't give you an excuse to just resist the tyrant just because he's a tyrant, right? We are to obey government and all things lawful, regardless of the government. Again, particular Baptists, we're very clear about that. It doesn't matter what government is in place. We're obeying the government and all things lawful. It could be a king, it could be a republic, it could be whatever. We obey the government and all things lawful because that's the general principle that God has given. But clearly they saw a difference in how that's carried out because there are different types of governments, right? But the point is they're going to obey the government in all things lawful. So that means that it can change. It can be different on how that is carried out depending on where you are. There's not one size fits all, right? So that means that Christians have to be wise and prudent and analyze the government nation that they're in. What are they doing in relation to the government that's putting out laws? What kind of laws are coming out? How are they executing these laws? How does this affect me and my family? All those things have to be prudently taken into account depending on where you live, your situation, whatever. It's not going to look the same, right? So there is a lot of wisdom and prudence that has to go in to submitting to government, just as there's a lot of wisdom and prudence that has to go into government ruling its people, right? It's not a cookie cutter, one size fits all. There has to be wisdom, prudence, prayer, maybe even counsel on what that looks like. I mean, for crying out loud, look what happened during COVID. I mean, people had all kinds of questions like, what do I do? Government's telling me to take the jab and I might lose my job. And how am I supposed to respond to that? I mean, all those were real questions that pastors had to deal with, that Christians had to struggle through. So there had to be wisdom and prudence and counsel and prayer and all these things on how, do churches close? Do Christians need to stay home? Do Christians need to mask? I mean, all these things. And there were people who were fighting, bickering over this stuff. I mean, it was, all these things came up. But wisdom and prudence have to be done in all of these things, depending on the context and the situation. All these things have to be taken into account. So the point is that how one submits to government is going to look differently depending on where you are, what nation you're in, maybe even what county you're in. I don't know. All those things have to be analyzed. But we have to be careful not to think that there is one form of government that is the ideal biblical government, and that somehow if something doesn't fall in line with that, or a government isn't doing it the way that I think is ideal, that means I get to do whatever I want. No, that's not biblical at all. The principle applies no matter what government is in place, but the how is going to look different depending on where you are. And again, the prudence, wisdom has to be implemented there. So I hope this is helpful. A lot of general principles, but I was, in studying this, it was really interesting diving deeper into the political theology of many particular Baptists, and just how they were so concerned, yes, for their own safety, but for the glory of God in obeying civil government, that they were very concerned about these things, because they saw it as a threat to the church. They saw it as a threat to the name of God if they didn't do this right, and following his will to live peaceable and quiet lives and worshiping God according to their conscience. And so they were very careful to try to flesh these things out in a way that is that's biblical and good for their neighbor. It's really interesting to read that. They spent a lot of time talking about these things, a lot of time. But anyways, I hope this gives you some good principles, even if you're not a particular Baptist. These are biblical principles that can be applied to your life as well, as a believer. And so, I hope it's edifying to you. I hope it's helpful and helps us to frame government better from the Christian's point of view and how we respond to government. Anyways, I hope everyone has a great rest of your weekend. If you're off, if you take the long weekend for President's Day, have a great long weekend. And Lord willing, we will be back next week. Take care. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find more of our podcast content. Also check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.